When our coalition government came to power back in May 2010, it pledged to eliminate the budget deficit by the end of the Parliament in 2015. This modest objective has already been postponed. Sluggish growth, weak tax receipts, and an approach to public spending which has at best trimmed overall expenditure. Much of the debate, of course, has focused around not just how quickly one should seek to close the deficit, but by what mixture of spending cuts and tax rises, as if this is some sort of binary debate. Of course, the government has cut the top rate of income tax from 50p to 45p, and indeed used Laffer curve arguments in pursuing that policy. However, our speaker tonight suggests that there is a wiser, smarter, and indeed evidentially proven alternative strategy. One of Dr Arthur Laffer's earliest successes was his involvement in Proposition 13, the initiative that slashed property taxes in Australia back in 1978. He was a member of President Ronald Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board from 1981 to 1989, regularly advised Margaret Thatcher on economic policy during the 1980s, and also advised President Clinton and Prime Minister Blair. His simple but revolutionary concept, the Laffer curve, that shows that you can actually cut tax rates but increase tax receipts, has inspired an economic revolution and has made Dr Laffer a household name, often indeed described as the father of supply-side economics. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming to the stage a hero of the free market movement, the truly legendary Dr Arthur Laffer.
Mark, thank you so much. That was lovely. I could have listened to you all night. I mean, he was talking about my favorite topic. If I may add just a little correction, can I do one correction? Prop 13 was in California, not Australia. It probably doesn't matter, does it really? I'm going to lower these microphones a little bit, if I may. One of the nicest things about being on the faculty at the University of Chicago for all those years was whenever I would follow Milton Friedman to the podium, I was actually able to raise the microphones. When I debate Robert Reich, I can also raise the microphones. But there's one difference between Milton Friedman and Robert Reich, is that I really looked up to Milton Friedman. Excuse me. Can I have a little fun with you tonight? Is that all right? Because economics is fun. I mean, it is great. And Charles Vickers, where are you? I even have a former, there you are, Charles, a former student from 43 years ago at the University of Chicago. I hope I live up to your standards, sir. I come here and I had a little fun, and I don't know if any of you have ever traveled a lot and stayed at a hotel. I stay at a hotel here, and they had a health club. You know those health clubs they have in the hotels where you go in and have all the machines and stuff like, you know what I mean. I was there, and I don't exercise a lot, as you can easily tell. But I was pretending down there in the health club to, be in the little machines and move and do all that sort of, what I'm talking about. And I was standing there and doing really nothing, and this beautiful lady walked in. I mean, just absolutely beautiful. And I just happened to be standing next to the manager of the health club at the time, and so I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, "Excuse me, but do you have any machines that would make someone like that attracted to someone like me?" And he said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I do." And he walked me over to the Citicorp ATM. Sorry. I'm going to start off a little story. Whenever I come to London, I always think of Lady Thatcher, and whenever I think of Lady Thatcher, I think of Ronald Reagan. I'm going to tell you a little story, a true story. It was in my house, and I had Reagan came over for lunch when there were about 8 or 10 of us at my home in California, and we got to chatting, and he was describing the first time he ever met Lady Thatcher, which was sort of funny. He said it wasn't really the first time, Arthur, because my godfather was a man named Justin Dart who had a flat here in London. And there was one time he had a little get-together, and I guess Lady Thatcher came over at that time, and Ronald Reagan had met her, but he didn't remember. It was just a little quick thing. But he said the first time I ever met Lady Thatcher, really, it was at a G7 meeting. Reagan was saying this was at a G7 meeting up in Canada, at Ottawa now. if you know Reagan, this is classic Reagan, G7, you know, that's the 7 countries get together. Now that's the United States, Canada, then he goes the UK, Germany, Italy, France, oh, and Japan. So he was pleased that he'd been able to do his little test. And he said, we were there, and the rules are, Art, at the G7 is that everyone refers to each other by their first names. So I got there a little bit late, and they were all sitting around the table there, and so I go into the room, and I'm sitting there with all of them sitting there. I said, hi, everybody, I'm Ronnie. Well, I don't know if you can find that just humorous. And he said he was sitting there in this meeting, in this thing, and it was run by Pierre Trudeau, you know, Pierre Trudeau up in Canada. And he said, the thing was just awful. He said, that Pierre fellow, Art, he was just being rude to this beautiful lady from England, this Prime Minister of England. He was just absolutely rude. He was saying nasty things to her, insulting her, demeaning her, all this time. It was just infuriating. Now, I'm the new kid on the block. I'd never been to a G7 meeting before, so I don't know what the protocol was, so I didn't say anything out, but I was fuming. I mean, and you remember how the old-timey cartoons used to have smoke coming out of the characters underneath? He said there was smoke coming out under my collar there, and I was just listening to that, and well, I didn't do anything, but I just was really offended, and I was just angry as all get out. And we took a break, and I settled up right over to Margaret Thatcher, and I said, Margaret, I couldn't hear what that Pierre fellow was saying about you. And I just want you to know I was offended right along with you. It was just awful what he said, and I just want you to know the only reason I didn't say something to him was because I don't know the protocol here, and I don't know whether it's right to say him or not. He was the host, but I just want you to know I was furious. And she said, oh, Ronnie, don't you worry yourself a bit. We girls know that boys can be boys. So that was his first story, and I had dinner with Lady Thatcher a few months later, and I'd videoed that story. And so I played it. She cried, so it was fun. Let me, if I can, well, their relationship was really special. We have really an interesting thing going on in the U.S., and I want to go through a couple things with you, but we have an election coming up in November. And obviously it's President Obama versus Mitt Romney, the presumptive Republican nominee. And it's a very different time today than it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, it was hard to tell the players without a play card. I mean, it really was. I don't know if any of you remember that in the middle of the campaign in 2008, both Barack Obama and John McCain both took a day off so they could go back to Washington, so they could both simultaneously vote for TARP. TARP was Toxic Asset Relief Program. I mean, most of the Republicans voted for TARP. Most of the Democrats voted for TARP. If you look at the issues back in 2008, you really couldn't tell a Republican from a Democrat. I mean, if you look at George W. Bush, and he's a nice man and all that, but an awful president. I mean, here we had a stimulus package in 2007. We had a housing bill, and we had a farm bill. In both of those bills, we had a stimulus add-on to those bills to stimulate the economy, sort of deficit finance stimulus spending. You with me on that? And then, of course, as you know, in 2008, in March, we had Larry Summers' famous $600 per capita tax rebate, where, you know, what happens is you're sitting there in your lounge chair. You've got your remote control in your left hand watching Dancing with the Stars. You've got your silver bullet in your right hand, watching it. In comes a check. It lands right in your desk. I mean, you don't have to do anything for it. You don't have to work. You don't have to give them a mortgage. It's just a check that lands on your table there. I mean, they call it a tax rebate, but of course it wasn't really a tax rebate, because if you paid too much in taxes, they didn't give it to you. You didn't have to pay any taxes for them to give it to you, but they just give you that check. You know what I'm talking about here? It's somewhat like what happened in Britain. And then we had the bailout of AIG. That was about $170 billion here. Forgive me for rounding errors in some of these things. $1.50 each way probably doesn't matter that much. Then we had some asset swaps with Bear Stearns. Do any of you remember that one? And then, of course, we had TARP, which I love. Do any of you remember the imagery of Paulson? Now, Paulson goes down to the Congress. He's squealing and breathing and going hysterical, sort of like a 5-year-old in a scary movie. You know, I just loved it. The bill that he gave to Congress to pass and had to be passed in one day, we're on the edge of the brink, even if you don't pass it, there can't be any hearings, granted him $700 billion authority to spend as he saw fit to save the U.S. economy. It was a 4-page bill, but those are congressional pages. Congressional pages have really wide margins, big print, wide lines. It's about 100, 150 words per page max on a congressional bill. So it was maybe 400, 600 word bill that gave him $700 billion with no hearings or anything like that. And he was going, if you don't pass it today, we go over the brink. You all remember this stuff then? Then, of course, after that, we nationalized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, our housing bills there. And then, of course, Barack Obama came in, and Barack Obama had his own plans. He had an $862 billion stimulus package. And then he also had Obamacare. And then he had also Dodd-Frank bill, if you remember all those. And so we had all of this stimulus pending. At first, during the Bush years, it really was W as well as the Democrats. There was no distinction. That has changed. While you couldn't tell the players apart in 2008, this year, in 2012, the lines are drawn precisely and very sharply. I'm going to go through a couple of them with you because they're really fun issues. Today, there is not one Republican that would vote for additional stimulus spending. In fact, there's not one Republican that would ever admit that he or she ever voted for TARP. I mean, the Republicans are to a person against any additional stimulus spending. The Democrats, to a person, are for additional stimulus spending. The divide has been really made very sharp and very clear. It's not just on stimulus spending, which I will talk about with you, but it's also on tax rates and the rich. There is not one Republican today that will vote for increasing tax rates on the rich. There's not one Democrat today that wouldn't vote for tax increases on the rich. I mean, that divide has happened. It's in lots and lots of other issues as well. What has happened is the policy debate has crystallized sharply. And that crystalline structure really has finally made it so that both sides are expressing very different views of the world. And to me, that's exactly what democracy is all about. When the politicians agree ahead of time before the election and they all come in with the same policies, the voters don't have any choice whatsoever. When they do come in with a sharp division as to what the two are, you really finally get a chance to really vote for it as you see fit. But this election is probably the single most important election in my lifetime. Maybe the '80 election was right in the same level. But it is a huge determiner of future policies. My view is, and I'll just tell you ahead of time, not keep in, I think the Republicans are going to keep the House. I think the Republicans are going to take the Senate. And I think the Republicans are going to handily defeat Barack Obama, is my view of the world. I think that's going to happen. What I expect you will see happening is that you will see the U.S. go into a 5-stage set of policies, and I'm just going to talk economics for a second. You're going to see something along the lines of Simpson-Bowles, where the tax base is going to be broadened substantially, lower tax rates. We're going to have a much lower rate flat tax. You're going to see spending restraint, something along the lines of the Ryan budget or cut, cap, and balance or balanced budget thing. So you're going to see a low rate flat tax, spending restraint. You're going to see monetary policy change dramatically, much more towards a sound monetary policy. You're going to see trade move to a free trade type of model. I mean, the Obama administration has not been very pro-free trade at all. The Republicans are pushing free trade very strongly. The notion is that foreigners produce some things better than we do, and we produce some things better than foreigners. We and they would be foolish in the extreme if we didn't sell them those things we make better than they do in exchange for those things they make better than we do. It's a win-win for everyone. David Ricardo, gains from trade, comparative. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of that stuff, but he was Brit too, wasn't he? Just teasing you. I think you're going to see that, and I think you're going to see a regulation reform in the U.S. as well, regulatory reform. I mean, everyone knows you have to have regulations. You can't wake up in the morning. Well, you have to wake up in the morning over here and drive on the left-hand side of the road. But in the U.S., if you did it, it would really be antisocial. You can't choose which side of the road you're going to drive on today. I mean, everyone knows you have to have regulations, but what you don't want is you don't want those regulations going beyond the specific purpose at hand and doing a lot of collateral damage to the overall system. So what I think you're going to see in the U.S. is a lower rate, flatter tax, spending restraint, sound money, free trade, and minimal regulations going forward. But let me, if I can, take you on two of the issues that I think are really fun, are on tax rates on the rich and stimulus spending. Because those two issues have really, really crystallized on two sides of the party. The tax rates and the rich issue, and let me take you through it. If you look at the tax rates in the rich, President Obama has been arguing that we should raise them to fund programs, et cetera. These people have plenty of money. They can afford to pay a little bit more. It's only just and fair, and that we need the money badly. Let me take you through the Republican view of this, because raising tax rates in the rich, and I don't want to go way over your heads on this one, but rich people don't like to pay taxes. That may, in fact, be why they're rich. And I'm going to go with the rich people. We've had a long experience in the U.S. on tax rates and rich. We put in the progressive income tax in the United States in 1913. Now, when we put in the progressive income tax in 1913, the highest marginal tax rate at that time was 7%. Okay? That was the tax rate on the rich. Now, I want to stipulate today, just so no one has any ambiguities of my views, I want to stipulate today that by raising the highest rate from 0% to 7%, revenues on the rich went up. I'm not going over your heads in this one, am I? Good. Let me take you through what happened after that. By 1919, now they put in this income tax in 1913. By 1919, they'd raised the highest tax rate in the rich to 77%. Is that a good enough increase for you during there? Now, they claimed it was the war that did all that, and we needed the money and all that sort of stuff. After the war, Woodrow Wilson picked his hand-picked candidate to run for president was the governor of Ohio, a guy named Cox, the sitting governor of Ohio. Cox picked his best friend to be his running mate, a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the race of 1920 was Cox and Roosevelt versus Warren Harding and Coolidge, Cal Coolidge. That was the race. The issue was exactly what it is today, tax rates. Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding ran on a return to normalcy, which means cutting tax rates back to their pre-war level. That's what they ran on. They beat Cox and Roosevelt by the largest percentage ever in U.S. history. It was a landslide victory. Let me tell you what they did. They cut the highest tax rate in America from 77% to 25%. Is that a good enough tax cut for you? Now, we have great, no, oh God, I'm in the right crowd today. Yay! I agree with you, it's not good enough, but it's, for a starter, it's all right. We have magnificent data on taxes. I mean, it's your doomsday book. The reason we have literature, the reason we have writing and all of that is so governments can collect taxes. I mean, that's what it's all about. We have great data on taxes. So we have data on tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners. We cut the highest rate from 77 to 25%. Now, as you know, in the US, as opposed to the rest of the world, we had a boom during the period. It was called the Roaring '20s. Just a huge expansion. If you look at the tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners, as a share of GDP, now not just in absolute dollars, but as a share of GDP, and remember that GDP went through the ceiling, tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went through the ceiling during the Roaring '20s. I mean, they went way up during the Roaring '20s. Then, as you know, we had a period of Herbert Hoover. He put in the Smoot-Hawley tariff and signed it into law in May of 1932. In May of 1930. In January of 1932, we raised the highest tax rate on the top income earners. We raised it from 25% to 63%. Is that a good enough raise for you in the middle of a depression? We were going to tax ourselves into prosperity. I don't know if you find that funny. It's the silliest notion I've ever heard. But they raised it from 25% to 63%. On January 1st, 1936, by the way, Hoover lost the election in 1932, landslide, Roosevelt came in. Roosevelt in 1935 realized he didn't have enough money. He put through a tax bill in 1935 which raised the highest rate on income earners in the U.S. from 63% to 79%. That up there enough for you? On up to 83%. By the way, I'm missing a lot of other taxes in there. He put on a 25% annual retained earnings tax, raised the inheritance tax. I mean, it went just on and on and on. If you look at the data on taxes, now they raised the highest rate from 25% to 83% during the Great Depression. As you may know, output did not do very well during that period. But if you look at tax receipts from the top 1% of income earners, in spite of the fact that they more than tripled the highest tax rate, tax receipt from the highest income earners as a share of GDP actually declined during that period. Actually declined. In spite of the fact that they lowered it from 77 to 25% during the 1920s, revenues as a share of GDP went up during that period. If you come to the post-World War II era, if you go to 1960-61, Jack Kennedy came into office. Jack Kennedy, the highest tax rate back then was 91% on income earners. Kennedy lowered that highest rate from 91% to 70%. Cut corporate rate from 52 to 48%. By the way, he tried to cut it to 46%, but thank God Barry Goldwater and the Republicans were able to block him from that irresponsible move. No, they forced him to push it back up to 48%. In fact, just for some fun U.S. history, Bob Dole voted against cutting the highest marginal income tax rate from 91% to 70% because he said we couldn't afford the revenue losses. I don't know if you find that humorous, but Bob Dole never seen a tax increase that he didn't love. But if you look at that during the Kennedy period, the go-go 60s, it was called the go-go 60s, a huge boom in the U.S. economy. We have tax revenue data. Tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went again through the roof as a share of GDP. Then we had a period which I like to refer to as the Four Stooges. It was Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, which I think of as the largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put on planet Earth. They raised tax rates throughout that whole period. You may remember it was Jerry Ford's whip inflation. Now, you guys, I don't know if you followed. That's when I did the curve on the napkin for my classmate and dear friend Dick Cheney. And Don Rumsfeld at the hotel trying to explain to him that they probably wouldn't get 100% of the revenues they thought they were going to get. If you look at that period, tax revenues as a share of GDP under those four presidents where they dropped as a share of GDP. Then you got, excuse me, does anyone have any water? Oh, no, I'm just teasing. Mark, don't jump. Then we got Ronnie. Excuse me, yeah. 1980, we elected Ronald Reagan. He took office on January 20th, 1981. 1978, in anticipation of the election, we put in Steiger-Hansen capital gains tax rate reduction. During that next 20-plus year period, we cut taxes on everything. If it walked, your taxes are cut. If you sat there, your taxes were cut. If you flew, your taxes were cut. You dug a hole, if you swam. I mean, it didn't matter. We cut tax rates across the board. Take a look at that period. Now, I'm going to take you through 1980 to 2007. In that period, tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners. Now, in 1980, tax revenues from the top 1% of income earners went from 1.5% of GDP in 1980, all right? If you take the total taxes collected from the top 1% of income earners and you divide it by GDP, you get 1.5%. If you look at total taxes paid, income taxes paid by the top 1% of income earners, in 1980, the top 1% of income earners paid 17.5% of all the income taxes in the U.S. All right? Those are the numbers. Take me now to 2007. By the way, the trend is just a linear trend throughout this period. Just it bobbles and wiggles, but it moves in the same direction. By 2007, the top 1% of income earners, if you take their total taxes and divide it by GDP, they paid 3.2% of GDP in income taxes. From 1.5% in 1980, in 2007, they paid 3.2% of total income. Huge. If you look at total income taxes paid, the top 1% of income earners paid 42.5% of all the income taxes collected in 2007. I mean, this stuff shouldn't surprise you. I mean, these are the facts of what actually happened in the U.S. It shouldn't surprise you. The highest income earners don't like to pay taxes. I mean, not many people do like to pay taxes, but they really don't like it. But they not only don't like to, they have the means to be able to hire people to help them around the taxes. They can hire lawyers, they can hire accountants, they can hire deferred income specialists, they can hire congressmen, they can hire senators. I mean, if you see a bunch of people hanging with the president, please don't for a moment think it's a bunch of street people trying to explain to the president what it's like being poor. They all want something from him. I know it's different over here, but in the U.S., that's the way it is. They not only have the means, the means to minimize their taxes, they have the ways to do it as well. The highest income earners can change the location of their income. They really can. I moved from San Diego, California, to Nashville, Tennessee, 6.5, 7 years ago. Why? There is no state income tax in Tennessee. There is a state income tax, by the way, in California. It's really high. You know, and I hope I'm not going way over your heads in this. If you have two locations, A and B, if you raise taxes in B, and if you lower them in A, workers and producers and people are going to move from to. Am I going way over your heads on this? I tried to explain that to a professor up at Harvard, and he said, well, I still don't get why you moved from California. You know, the air comes in here and the hair comes out over here. It's just amazing. Location really does matter. People can change the location of their income. They can change the timing of their income. I mean, we have all sorts of provisions to change. We have IRAs, KIOs, 401ks that allow people to change the timing of their income to control the payment of taxes. I mean, if you look at Jack Welch's contract upon leaving GE, it's like 350 pages long. I mean, all these detailed things that he's paid in kind, all driven by taxes. I mean, rich people can change the timing of their, rich people can change the volume of their income. They really can. And they can change it, and they do. Rich people can also change the composition of their income. Let me use the example I love to use. I don't know if you've ever heard, we have a very famous French guy living in the U.S. named Warren Buffett. You know who I mean, Warren Buffett. I mean, let me give you the story on Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is worth $50 billion according to Forbes. At least at the end of 2010 he was. Now, if I had Warren Buffett's balance sheet in front of me, by the way, I'm not going to cast any aspersions on Warren Buffett, although I'd like to, but I'm not. If I had his balance sheet here, what on his asset side would you see? He owns stock in a company called Berkshire Hathaway. All right? He got that stock at very low prices long ago when it wasn't worth much, and now it's appreciated dramatically. And his net worth, if you take out all the cost of exercise of his options and take his whole stock there, his net worth is $50 billion in a form called unrealized capital gains. Can any of you tell me what the tax rate is on unrealized capital gains? It's 0. Warren Buffett, all the top 500 people in the wealthiest 500 have a large portion of their income in very, very income-advantaged, tax-advantaged forms. Now, Warren Buffett has it there. You know, if you look at his 2010 letter to the New York Times, which I loved, he said that he pays less taxes than his secretary. I mean, considerably less tax rates. He said he paid $7 million in tax, a little bit less, $6,900,000 and something or other, but whatever, just close to $7 million, he said in the New York Times. And that represented 17.4% of his income. Now, I am very good with math. I want you to be aware of that. So I took the $7 million he paid in taxes. I divided it by 0.174, and I came up with his taxable income was about $40 million. All right, that's what he paid. Now, $40 million seems like a lot. In that year, 2010, his net worth went from $40 billion to $50 billion. And in addition to that, if you go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation website, he gave away $1.9 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, the way I calculate income using the Henry Simon definition of income is that his income that year was at least $11.5 billion, and he paid $7 million in taxes, which means that he paid about 6/100ths of 1% of his income in taxes. If you went to the Buffett rule, which now is being touted all over as what Obama's done, do you think he recommended that there should be a tax applied to unrealized capital gains? No. What does he do? I mean, a person like Warren Buffett can borrow money from a bank. When you're worth $50 billion, they will lend you some money. He borrows money from the bank to live on. By the way, a lot of these people doing that, and there's nothing wrong or illegal or inappropriate about it, but he borrows the money. He has interest expense, which is deductible. He then can exercise just enough income and sell off enough capital gains to report income there so that he can deduct his full interest expenses. And that's what happens in this thing. What I'm trying to tell you is rich people have lots and lots of options that middle and lower income people don't have. You shouldn't be surprised if you find rich people highly sensitive to tax rates. And they are. When you raise taxes on rich people, you collect less revenues. When you lower tax rates on rich people, they give up their lawyers, their accountants, their programs, their things, and they pay their taxes on it. It shouldn't surprise you that that's not true of all the population. This is one of the debates right now, is should we raise tax rates on the rich? That is the one side and the other side, and that is a clean divide on the two parties. The second clean divide that I want to take you on and conceptually, and do all of you see the debate on raising tax rates on the rich and what's going on with it? That is the debate. What will raising tax rates on the rich do? My view is it'll hurt the economy and you'll lose the money. That doesn't seem like a winning proposition to me. The Democrats say that the economy doesn't respond to interest rates, and by the way, we'll collect more money and we desperately need it. I have, again, never heard of an economy being taxed into prosperity, but maybe I missed that in Econ 1. The second issue I want to go through with you is equally as fun. And it's, again, become clear, crystal clear in the political debate in the U.S., has to do with stimulus spending. Now, all of you remember your Keynesian economics. You all were in class. You all were there. You all took it. Let me, if I can, describe deficit financed stimulus spending to you. And I'm going to use Larry Summers' description of it. And I'm going to use it with regard to his proposal, which was in March of 2008, which was to give everyone a check for $600. Okay? I'm going to use that. He said, look, if you give a guy a check for $600, bam, there it is. That guy's going to spend more than he otherwise would have spent had he not received that check for $600. You follow me? That's what he said. That in turn, that guy, by spending more than he otherwise would have spent had he not received that check for $600, that in turn will create jobs, output, and employment by the people who are now going to supply him with the goods and services that he otherwise would not have purchased had he not spent the money which he spent because he got the $600. All of you follow me? Those people who now produce the additional goods and services that he is now buying that he wouldn't have bought had he not got the check, they're going to have higher incomes than they otherwise would have had. They're going to spend more. And there's going to be this cascading effect through the economy. Are all of you following me on this? All right? Some of you may remember that the increase in spending per dollar of income that you get, that's the marginal propensity to consume. The total increase in output, when this whole thing, we sum the infinite series and we get the total increase in output. We take the total increase in stimulus spending. If you take the total increase in output and divide it by the stimulus spending, that's the multiplier. If any of you are a little bit nerdy, and you sort of like this stuff, and I do, I love it. The multiplier is also 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. All right? You follow? All of you following me? That is exactly the logic. You can go through this with Bernstein Romer's paper in January of 2009. They go through this exact model. That is what stimulates the economy. And with this, after this explanation, Larry Summers goes and sits down. It's over. That is why we're doing this stimulus package. Again, I want to make sure that all of you realize this is exactly why they proposed deficit finance stimulus spending. No additional, no less. Now, as far as Larry Summers went on that description, he's right. It is true that if you give a guy $600 more than that guy otherwise would have had, that guy's probably going to spend a little bit more than he otherwise would have spent. That's true. That in turn will create more jobs, more output, more employment. That's true too. Those people will have higher incomes and there'll be this cascading effect through the economy. Are all of you following me on this? And it will increase output. There's no question in my mind that it's true that the transfer recipients will spend more, and this will create more jobs, more output, more employment, and there will be this cascading effect through the system. But it's only part of the truth. It's one chapter on a 3-chapter story. And let me, if I can, try to go to the second and third chapters with you. Unfortunately, I'll use the US example. I'll use both of them. Unfortunately, the Tooth Fairy no longer works on the Treasury staff. Or to be by British one, see if I can do this properly. The Father Christmas, oh, I love Father Christmas, no longer works at the Exchequer. Is that okay with you? The government doesn't create resources. The government redistributes resources. For everyone the government bails out, there's someone they put into trouble, dollar for dollar. You can't bail someone out of trouble without putting someone else into trouble. They don't create resources. If there are 100 apples, if you take 10 of those apples and give them to people based upon some characteristic other than work effort, the workers and producers who produce those 100 apples have 10 apples less than they otherwise would have had. If you remember your microeconomics, any of you, it's the Slutsky equation, which is the income and substitution effects of a change in the price or a transfer payment, if any of you remember that. If you look at your Slutsky equation and sum it over an economy, the sum of the income effects in an economy always sum to 0. This was brought into economics by a man named Leon Volra, a French economist. It was brought into English by Lord Hicks in his wonderful book, Value and Capital, if any of you remember that. The example I like to use, I'm going to use Leon Volra's example, which is if the price of apples rises, it is very true that apple growers will be wealthier, they'll have higher incomes, and they will spend more. That's very true. But it's equally as true. If the price of apples rises, apple growers will be poorer, they will have lower incomes, and they will spend less. And these two effects will offset each other by the hour, by the day, by the week, by the month, by the year, to the 9,874th decimal place. There is no stimulus in stimulus spending, period. The stimulant to the transfer recipient is completely offset by the destimulant to the transfer payer. The way I like to do this, and let me, if I can just explain it and trying to make it simple and easy to come across. The problem with a 315 million person world is it's really hard to get your arms around the concepts. I mean, if you sit there and look at a 315 million person world, you've got Chinese capital flows, you've got credit default swaps, you've got velocity, you've got multipliers, you've got all these things going on. You just can't keep track of the T accounts. There are just way too many things moving for you to follow and understand and being able to aggregate all these partial derivatives as everything goes around to get the total derivative. But if it's good economics, it works just as well in a 2-person world as it does in a 315 million person world. Good economics is scalable. Good economics is scalable. The only thing that's neat about a 2-person world is you can actually see the results in a 2-person world. Imagine for a moment we had a 2-person world, Farmer A and Farmer B. Okay, that's it. Farmer A and Farmer B. If Farmer B gets unemployment benefits, who do you think pays for them? Am I going way over your heads again here? You know, as my former colleague used to say, government spending is taxation pure and simple. Government, when they spend the money, not only adds to demand, which they do, they also reduce demand by taking the resources from the rest of society by the same dollar amount. There is no stimulus in stimulus spending. Are we all together? The transfer recipients are stimulated, the transfer payers are not, and they exactly offset each other. But that's only the second chapter. The third chapter gets really ugly. The third chapter has to do with the substitution effects. If you go back to your Slutsky equation, and you sum the Slutsky equations in an economy, while the income effects always net out to 0, what happens is the substitution effects don't. They aggregate over all the individuals. The guy you give the money to now finds a new way of getting resources without working. That substitution effect will cause him to work less. The guy from whom you take the resources finds he gets less resources for working than he otherwise would have, and he works less as well. These substitution effects accumulate. Now, I had the worst time with this. This is 1974. Jerry Ford, all these politicians in the U.S., I'm sure they do it in the U.K. too, all tried this free lunch, that stimulus spending, that you can do that and it helps the economy. We had one. Jerry Ford tried his program, which was a tax rebate back in 1974. I was testifying before Senator Nelson from Wisconsin, and I was on the podium with four of us were on the podium. Otto Eckstein, Paul McCracken, and Gardner Ackley were the other three, and they loved the program, and of course I didn't love it. I thought it was nonsense. I didn't think. And I was trying to explain to Senator Nelson the substitution effects, and I couldn't figure out a cool way of explaining it to make him really see it intuitively. So finally I said to him, Senator Nelson, if these other three economists are correct, what's wrong with you? I mean, what's wrong with you? Why would you only do $600? That's just a little improvement in the economy. Let's have a boom. I mean, let's do $6,000, $60,000, $600,000, $1 million, 100% of GDP. Imagine what would happen to the economy if you gave everything to all those who didn't work and didn't produce, and you gave nothing to all those who did work and did produce. Senator, what do you honestly think would happen to output? Do all of you feel it, see it? While the transfer recipients are stimulated, the transfer payers are destimulated, and the net effect is zero. And the substitution effects mean it goes down. The reason why we have the Great Recession today, the reason why we have it is because of the stimulus spending, not in spite of it. When the government increases all this stimulus spending, it not only doesn't improve things, it is the reason why things are as bad as they are today, period. Milton Friedman is totally correct when he says government spending is taxation. I don't know if any of you saw my piece in the Wall Street Journal. I think it was a week and a half ago, where I looked at the U.S. During Bill Clinton, government spending fell by the most. Government spending as a share of GDP fell by more than the combined effects of the next four best presidents combined. Look at the boom we had under Clinton. If you look under George W. Bush, his last 2 years in office, when Pelosi took over the House and Reid took over the Senate, we had the biggest increase in government spending in peacetime ever. I mean, the huge increase from 21+% of GDP to 27.5% of GDP. Look at what happened to the economy during that period. I dare you to take a look at all those countries that did not go along with the deficit finance stimulus spending in the last 6 years, and look at how their economies have performed versus those that went through. Let me just say that this is the issue in the U.S. It's clear, it's crystal clear. The Republicans, not one Republican will vote for any additional stimulus spending. All the Democrats were. It is the most consequential election. I could go through a lot of other stuff with you on this election, but I have never seen an election more crystallized as to the brands of economics that's going on in the U.S. If you look at the way things are going in the polls and what are going on in the elections, if you follow it carefully, I think we're going to win. And I think we're going to win by a very large majority coming in. I guess I'll stop there, but I want to tell one last story of Reagan. Can I tell you my favorite story of Reagan's? Is that all right? I've got a bunch of them with Lady Thatcher that are really fun too, but Reagan, my favorite story of the president's is it was, I forget, 1980. When was the Grenada invasion? You all know Grenada. It's a little bitty island in the Caribbean. And the Cuban troops came in there. There was a bunch of schools, medical schools, sort of offshore medical schools. And the Cubans had troops in there. And I forget, the prime minister of Grenada, I think, called Reagan and wanted something. And he sent troops there. And it was this little skirmish. And we shot 2 of them. And that was it. But it was a big deal because to me, it was the first time we had U.S. troops on foreign soil fighting communists, foreign communists. I mean, even though it wasn't a big-scale Soviet Union deal, this was U.S. mano-a-mano against Cuban soldiers. I mean, it was really a big deal. Reagan used to come out to California, 4 or 5 times a year, and he'd go up to the ranch, as you know, up to Rancho Cielo, and he'd chop wood, and he'd ride his horse around. And then at the end of the day, he and Mrs. Reagan would come down in the helicopter, and they'd come down to Los Angeles. They'd stay at the Century Plaza Hotel. Do any of you know the Century Plaza? It's sort of this crescent-shaped hotel right there. There's the annex on the back, which is a big square building. And the top two floors of the annex are the presidential suite. That's where it was. And the helicopter come down and land on the roof, and Reagan and Mrs. Reagan would be in the presidential suite, and they'd have 3 or 4 of us over for cocktails before they'd went with their crowd to Chasen's, the restaurant over there. They'd go with 4 or 5 other couples, but they allowed us kids, and if you can imagine a world where I was one of the kids, but have us over, and we'd chat for about an hour, and he was pretty fun because he always had a drink. His favorite drink was orange juice and vodka. I guess you call it a screwdriver if you do. I guess you don't smell the vodka. It's sort of like why you put the orange juice in. I don't know. But that was his favorite drink. And we were over there, and I cornered him right away. I said, "Sir, you got to tell me, honestly, you got to tell me. I mean, how did you make that decision to go into Grenada? You got to tell me, sir. I mean, 1 minute it's no, the next minute it's yes. Surely in that 2-minute interval, you didn't get enough new information to push you over the edge. You got to, how did you make that decision to go into Grenada?" And I swear to God, he looks at me and said, "Well, Art, I just asked myself, what would John Wayne have done?" And if you think about it for 2 seconds, it's the right answer. What would you do if the script were written for the guy with the white hat? And with that, I will end, and I will open it for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got about 15 minutes or so for questions, and I think we've got Ross and Gurpreet at the back of the room. If you can raise your hand in the air, I'll try and pick you out. And if you could say who you are and where you're from, if you don't mind sharing that information with us, we'd be grateful. So I'll take the gentleman here to begin with, 4 rows from the back.
Good evening. It's great to see you again, Professor Laffer, and to hear you.
Thank you, sir.
Your style hasn't changed. I'm not going to ask you a difficult question. I'm going to leave that to the others.
This is, by the way, a former student, just so you all know. Now he gets his chance to get even with me. No, I'm just here. Charles, go ahead.
But I'd like to, 43 years ago, when you labored to teach me economics, and I think you probably did, so thank you. At that time, the world was new, really. You were 29, and I was considerably younger. My question is a reflective one, and it's in 4 parts.
Blimey.
Jeez.
There are some other hands up, if you could make that.
Looking back 43 years, would you say that you are now a wiser man or not? Part 2, would you say that you were sadder or happier? Part 3, what would you attribute that to? And part 4, if there's something you now know that you didn't know 43 years ago, but you felt you would have taught us had you known it, what would that have been?
And 4, what's the 4th part? Come on,
That's the 4th part.
Oh, that's 4, okay.
Yeah.
Easy question to start with. I'll pick more of your extras.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know that I'm as happy today as I've ever been. But you know, Charles, I've always had lithium in my blood. I mean, I always see a glass as half full. I've always been optimistic, and I've been very pleased with the way the world's gone. We've been winning this revolution for years and years. You know, it comes ebbs and flows, but we are really making huge headway. I went back with you in this discussion to say that at the end of World War II, the highest marginal income tax rate in America was about 93%. When Kennedy took office, it was 91%. It has been coming down dramatically. Markets are much freer today than they ever have been. It doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go. But I guess the most wonderful thing is I had kids like you in my class, and I just loved it. And you were the ones I practice on. So, yeah, thank you. And I'm much happier because I actually lived to this age. I didn't know that I was going to back then.
Gentleman over there on the side.
Quentin Langley, University of Bedfordshire Business School. You've come up with a politically convenient way for governments to raise more revenue. aren't you worried that as a result governments will raise more revenue and spend it on stupid stuff?
Should we not
A good
trying to
one.
get to the top of that?
Yeah, that's a good worry. You don't want to maximize revenues. That is not the role of government. What you'd want to do is really maximize the welfare of, of your electorate, of the people. And that would mean that you will always want tax rates way below where they should be, where they would be on the revenue maximizing position. You really don't ever want to be anywhere near that position. And if you look at the UK today, and I'm going to speak a little bit out of turn, I'm not a professional on the UK economics, so forgive me, but I mean, the stuff about going from 40 to 50p, the evidence is so obvious on what happened to revenues, raising the VAT from 17.5% to 20. I mean, God's truth, please. And you know, the revenues aren't coming in. You go into a double dip, you have a second recession going on here. I mean, all of that's classically predictable by what the government did. And they only looked at the own rates of return on the, what do they call, the self-assessment people? But if you look at all the other effects that these people have, property value, property taxes, sales taxes, payroll taxes, all these other taxes that are lost in addition to the revenues that didn't come in on the other, because these people employ other people, and when they leave the country, they take their jobs, they're up with their homes, all of that stuff. I would guess that the revenue loss is multiple of what these people say. Not only is the revenue loss a multiple, but by having a slower economy, you have more people unemployed, more people in poverty, which means more welfare spending. You know, that's not what you want to do. And so when I look at a country, my first thought is not what is the maximum revenue tax. My first thought is how do you create prosperity? And the way I would do it on government is there are a lot of functions government should do, and they do better than the private sector, or at least the electorate wants them to do it. What you do is you look at the benefit of spending an additional dollar, and you compare it with the cost of raising an additional dollar in taxes. And you want to make that benefit a smidgen higher than the cost of raising that additional dollar in taxes. And it is at that level that you stop spending. That is where you stop it. My guess it would be substantially lower than you do right now. But what I was trying to talk about with you guys today is all of that above and beyond that is the deficit finance stimulus spending. I mean, that number in the US in the 4 years was about $3.75 trillion. Now, those are big numbers. Annual tax revenues in the US during this period were about $2.3 trillion. So this is a year and 3 quarters worth of total taxes they spent just on the hopes that it would stimulate the economy. Now, I was asked time and again what I would have done. And I said, you know, what I would have done is I'd have gotten a brown paper bag, put it over my mouth, breathe until the panic went away, and then I'd do nothing. If that doesn't work, I put my hands over my ears, I shut my eyes, and I yell, I'm not listening, I'm not listening, I'm not listening. You know, whenever people make decisions, when they are either panicked or drunk, the consequences are rarely attractive. And that is it. Now, if you forced me to do something, forgive me, but if you forced me to do something with that $3.75 trillion, what I would have done, it's about 1 3/4 years worth of taxes. Just imagine if in 2008, instead of doing all this stimulus spending, we'd said, hey, everybody, we're going to have a 1 3/4 year federal tax holiday. No federal taxes of any sort. No income tax, no corporate tax, no capital gains tax, no dividend tax, no death tax, no payroll tax, either employer or employee, no excise tax, no Medicare tax, no Medicaid tax, no tariff, no taxes for a year and 3/4. Can you imagine what would have happened to the U.S. economy? Hell, we'd be selling cars into central China, for goodness sakes. There'd have been, grandma would be out there working. Now, I got maybe another hour left in me before I die. You know, their unemployment rate would have gone down to 0.5%. They'd have been scrambling so hard. If you want production, make production attractive. If you tax people who work and you pay people who don't work. Do I need to say the next sentence to you? If you tax rich people and give the money to poor people, you're going to get lots and lots of poor people and no rich people. The dream in this world has always been to make the poor rich, not to make the rich poor. You balance up, not down. There's nothing wrong with being rich. It's wonderful. I just wish someday I would become one of them. But there's something desperately wrong with being poor. What you want to do is cure the poor problem, not create a rich problem. And you know, when you look at poor people, you know what the answer is. I know it is. No one ever becomes prosperous on handouts. That doesn't happen. The best form of welfare is still a good, high-paying job. And you can't love jobs and hate job creators. You just can't do it. You need supply incentives across the board to create a political economy of growth. I'm sorry, I love the question, yeah.
At the front here, 3 rows back. If you just wait for the microphone to come to you. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you. David Brand, retired IT consultant. Socialists often talk about the multiplier effect of stimulus spending. In practice, what do you think that value is? And connected to that, what percentage of such stimulus is taken by government bureaucracy?
Yeah, the multiplier is 0. It is 0. All the research and everything, the stimulus to the transfer recipients, as I said, is offset by the de-stimulus there. There is no stimulus in the stimulus package. Now, if you go to the Bernstein-Romer paper, they go through all the literature of all the multiplier effects and all of that, and they come to a consensus multiplier. If you remember, what they did was they then did an estimate of what the increase in output would be from the $862 billion stimulus package that Obama proposed. They then spread it over a number of quarters. So they took a multiplier, I forget what it was, 1.7 or something like 2, something like that. Then they used Okun's law, and they worked it backwards as to what the increase in employment would be and then what the reduction in the unemployment rate. If you look at their number, go back and look at it, they said that by now we'd be down to an unemployment rate of 4%, 4.5%. They missed by only a little bit. I don't want to criticize them for doing the paper. The paper is what they should do, and that's what we all should do. If you're an economist, you should say what you think actually will happen. You should do a paper on it and do an unconditional forecast to allow people to come back and evaluate whether you were right or not. There's nothing wrong with being wrong in the broad sense of the word. That's how knowledge goes up. So I'm not criticizing Romer and Bernstein for doing the paper. What I am doing is saying that the model doesn't work. And if you can see here, it really hasn't worked here either.
In the aisle here. I'll take both of you, but John first, John Wilden.
John Wilden, Global Health Futures. You obviously knew Margaret Thatcher very well. I'm just wondering, that had a very good effect on this country. I'm just wondering if you could make friends with George Osborne and David Cameron in the same way.
My pleasure. No, I'm not going to touch it. Go.
Right at the back. At the back. At the back.
Wait, wall. There you go.
Both the US and UK governments have gone on a binge of printing money called quantitative easing. I'd be curious on your views on A, did the first 200 billion really work? Was it the right thing to do? And if it was the subsequent printing of the next 125 billion worth it?
Yeah, I don't know where you get these little numbers. In the US, we did a lot more than that. And I think it was September or October of 2008, the monetary, you're talking about the monetary policy.
Those are UK numbers.
Oh, those are UK numbers, excuse me. I'm going to use US numbers. In September, October 2008, the monetary base of the US, which is currency in circulation plus member bank reserves, was about, I think it was about 840 billion. Of that, about 45 billion of that was reserves, member bank deposits held at the Fed, and about, 795 billion was currency in circulation. We have had two rounds of quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, and then we had Operation Twist 1 and Operation Twist 2, all right, all done by Ben Bernanke at there. Today, the balance sheet of the Fed is maybe somewhere in the order of magnitude between $2.7 and $2.8 trillion, all right? That's what, the currency in circulation has gone from maybe 795 billion to maybe a trillion. So we have reserves held at the Fed of maybe 1.75 trillion now instead of 45 billion. We've expanded the monetary base not only by more in percentage terms than any time ever in our history, but times 50. It's a huge expansion. We have basically monetized a lot of the Treasury debt we've done. If you look at the balance sheet of the Fed now, the balance sheet of the Fed, they own the predominance of all long-term bonds in the U.S. With Operation Twist, they sold short-term bonds and they purchased all the long-term bonds to try to keep those rates down. They have that is exactly what's happened. My fear, of course, is that you can't keep going on this stuff and zero interest rate stuff forever. And if, in fact, you ever saw interest rates go up again, let's say from 1.5% on the 10-year bond to maybe 7%, 7.5%, 8%, you would have a capital loss on the Fed's balance sheet of about $1 trillion. It would be insolvent to the amount of about $1 trillion. That's not a bailoutable number. It really isn't. And what you've got is a real problem. What's happened here, and let me just explain to you why this has all happened. Way in the back of the mind of an economist is the model you learned when you began. And you know, that model is in your atavistic core, right on the reptilian part of your brain. For Keynesians, you know, and we all were taught Keynesian economics, I was, everyone else is too. You have two sort of equations, two curves. Do you remember your ISLM curve? The horizontal axis is income, the vertical axis is the interest rate. Do you remember that one? You remember that savings has to equal investment. Savings is a function of income, positively, and investment is a function of interest rates, negatively. Do you remember that? So you have the IS curve, which is downward sloping from the upper left to the lower right on the curve where the horizontal axis is Y. That's the IS curve. And the LM curve, you have the supply of money is created by the Fed, so that's M. And then there are two components to the demand for money. L1, which is the transactions demand for money, depends upon income. And then there's the speculative demand for money, which depends upon interest rates. All right? So when interest rates are low, you demand a lot of money because you don't want to hold bonds because you'll have a capital loss if the interest rates go up. And when interest rates are high, you want to hold no money and hold all bonds because you know interest rates are going to come down. You all follow me there? The LM curve goes the other way. What you've had happen with all these economists running your countries is they have done exactly what you would have done in Econ 10 macro class, is they shifted the IS curve as far out to the right as they possibly could with deficit finance stimulus spending. And Ben Bernanke has shifted the LM curve as far out as you can by printing money. When you print money, you're supposed to increase income and lower interest rate. Well, the interest rates are low. But if you look at the results on income, I don't think you're going to find they worked out the way they thought they would. But that's where you are in this. I don't know how you unwind this monetary policy. I could have gone through this one and a lot more in that lecture on the money. I didn't. But again, the Republicans are completely, they're going to fire Bernanke if we win. And I think Obama will keep him if we lose. It's all of these issues are crystal clear across the board. And lots of other ones too. They're very, very important. I mean, defense, regulation, all of this stuff are just completely diametrically opposed views of the world.
Let me see if we can get a couple more questions in. Here in the middle on the aisle.
Paul Bowes, tax consultant. What is your view on a general anti-avoidance provision?
Tax policy doesn't work unless you get the implicit approval of the taxpayers. There has to be voluntary compliance. Now, you're always going to get some scofflaw and brigand and guy who cheats, you know, compulsively, genetically, whatever it is, cheats. But what you actually want to do on taxes is, you know, there are two types of incentives in this world. They're positive and negative incentives. By way of illustration, if you beat a dog, okay, you know where the dog's not going to be. You have no idea where the dog is going to be. By beating the dog's going to run, but you don't know where it's going to run. If, on the other hand, you feed a dog, the positive incentive, you know exactly where the dog will be. Positive incentives tell people what to do, and negative incentives tell them what not to do. Don't put your hand on the hot stove. The stove could care less where your hand is as long as it's not on it. All right? Taxes are like beating. You know what people will not do? They will not report taxable income. What you don't know is how they won't report taxable income. They'll use evasion, avoidance, underground economy, they'll go out of business, they'll move offshore, they'll do all these things to avoid reporting taxable income. So what you want to do on taxes is you want the lowest possible tax rate on the broadest possible tax base, so that you provide people with the least incentives to evade, avoid, or otherwise not report taxable income, and you give them the least places to which they can escape. And that's the optimal. Yeah, you're always going to get some guy trying to avoid taxes, but as long as it's legal, it's the way you should have it. You know, raising tax revenues is not cheap or costless, and it's much more costly than just the money you collect. It causes all sorts of distortionary behavior in the taxpayers, and that is far more expensive. They have additional expenses of hiring lawyers, accountants, and audits, and all that other nonsense, and hiring IRS agents. And so you got to be really careful to make sure you get as much a voluntary compliance in the code you can get. In the US, that's why I am today recommending one of the first things that Romney does when he takes office is we have a federal, state, and local tax amnesty program along with a flattening tax and broadening base. You know, the IRS estimates that some 15% of all income is below sub-economy, black economy. I don't know what it is here. I'm sure it's maybe even higher than that. If you look at our total federal taxes alone, it's about $2.5 trillion today. If you look at state and local taxes, maybe another $1.5 trillion. So we have about $4 trillion worth of taxes every year collected. Now, if 20% of that sub-economy is in the black market, you know, that means $800 billion a year is being lost by tax evasion, avoidance, all that stuff. You know, if we had a federal, state, and local tax amnesty program, now you have to make it federal, state, and local because we have tax treaties amongst all branches of government. So therefore, if you're cheating on your federal income tax, you're probably cheating on your state income tax too. And so if even though you got amnesty in your federal thing, as soon as the state caught you, wham, you're in jail. A guy's been cheating for 20 years, not reporting income. He can't start paying his taxes this year. Guess what they'll do? They'll fine. I mean, so what you need to do is have federal, state, and local. My guess is if we had a federal, state, and local tax amnesty program, we would raise somewhere between $800 billion and $1 trillion in 90 days. That's a real big quick hit to that budget deficit and bringing down that. We have a little thing in California. I used to live in San Diego, California, and I used to drive down from Los Angeles to San Diego. Did any of you ever drive the Coast Highway there? It's really cool. You get to Oceans, you get to San Clemente, where Nixon used to live, and you know all that, Casa Pacifica and all that. And then you go right on down by the nuclear reactors there, and it's 25 miles of nothing. I mean, just open land. And then you get to Oceanside. If you were able to drive across, you could drive from the 5 to the 15, and it'd be 20 miles to the 15, which goes up and down 2 parallel freeways up and down. This is Camp Pendleton. Camp Pendleton is 500 square miles of Southern California beachfront property. Now, I hope I've got my math right, but there's 640 acres per square mile. Is that approximately right? If they're 500 square miles, that's 332,000 acres on beachfront property in Southern California. It might be worth $1 or $2. I mean, why not sell it? And you reduce that. I guess you get $400 billion for that, easy. We have a place where up near my farm in Kentucky called Fort Knox. Have you ever visited, any of you? I ask everyone, a couple of people said, yeah, I visited. Did you see the gold? No, I didn't. It's hidden. They won't show it to you. It's been hidden since 1933. Hidden. That's, what's that, 79 years? No one's seen it. If it's still there, but no one's seen it, let's sell the damn stuff. That's another $400 billion. If you want to raise revenues, you can raise revenues dramatically and very quickly. My view is that you want to raise taxes as much as you possibly can, but not raise tax rates. You want to raise taxes by creating prosperity, growth, output, and employment. You can't balance the budget on the backs of the unemployed. Tax them all you want, you still won't get anything. You need output, employment, and production to bring that down, if that makes sense to you.
Rory Meakin from the Taxpayers Alliance. You've spoken a lot and made the case wonderfully for lower rates to improve the incentive effects and to get people working more and producing more and the rest of it. With the Institute of Directors, we've published the single income tax, which radically simplifies taxes, particularly direct taxes. Can you let us know what you think about.
You gave it to
reports
me.
of
I
simplicity.
received it yesterday at the Institute. I thank you very much. I haven't read it yet, but I asked them to send it right over to my. I'll read it. I love it. Of course, a single income tax or something of that ilk is what we need. I mean, I proposed the one I did, which was Jerry Brown's tax in 1992, a liberal Democrat, that you get rid of all federal taxes and have 2 flat rate taxes. I got rid of the income tax, the corporate tax, all payroll taxes, both employer, employee, Medicare, Medicaid taxes, capital gains tax, death tax, all of them. You know, all those taxes, got rid of every single tax. Well, with one exception, I kept sin taxes. The reason I kept sin taxes is that sin taxes are really not so much for revenues as they are to change people's behavior. You know what I mean? Fines and that sort of stuff. We Americans, for example, don't like drunk people smoking while they shoot each other. Excuse me. But I kept saying that if you had those 2 flat rate taxes, now just think of this. If you had those 2 flat rate taxes, made it static revenue neutral at full employment, which is higher there. One, a tax on VAT from $1 to $N, and one, a tax on personal unadjusted gross income from $1 to $N. Flat rate from the first dollar to the last dollar. If you did that, you could match all revenues with a rate of 11.8%. And in most cases, people wouldn't even have to file a tax return. You know, if you make $100, the government gives you, the guy gives you $88.80 and sends in $11.80 into the government. You don't even have to file. Now, if you mow your neighbor's lawn for $10, you got to send $1.80. You do have to do that. Okay? I guess $1.18, not $1.80. But that's the type of tax code you want.
I'm going to take one final question at the front here. You've been waiting a long time, haven't you? This will be the last question. I'm sorry.
The lady, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Laffer, for being one of my economic heroes. My question is, well, I'm only 21, so sorry, the enthusiasm. My question is, economics is really about, the most elegant underlying thought of economics is that it is the management of the household. And we're not really doing that. Our ecology is in a state of despair. And there are a lot of problems with our environment and everything. And this is leading to rather illiberal conclusions on flogging the rich, illiberal economic policy and all that. And I was wondering, what would your solution be in order to make sure that we take care of the things that sustain us?
Do you think we're running the household badly? You use Apple's, Margaret Thatcher always used the household budget as your analogy of how to run a tight ship.
Well, you know, let me tell you what I really would do. Okay, this is just us tonight. If I had one thing I could put in how to run the household correctly, okay, and I'll be fairly simple with you on this. If you had 2 companies, Company A and Company B, identical companies, okay? Well, one difference. Company A, the officers and directors, have very high salaries. They own no stock and they have no stock options. Company B, the exact same company, except the officers and directors, have low salaries. They have a lot of stock options. They own a lot of stock. Which one of those 2 companies would you like to invest in? You with me on that in there? The problem is that politicians don't have any skin in the game. They don't bear the consequences of their own actions. Imagine you have Mr. Smith goes to Washington, all right? He goes there imbued with human kindness. He works all day long. He gets all of his fun. And he's able to bring inflation way down, interest rates way down, the unemployment rate way down, the employment rate, production output soars, the stock market soars, prosperity abounds in the land. Foreigners that are hostile to us wilt before our very eyes. The animals multiply in the fields. The fields turn green. The trees blossom. And the children are all dancing in the street. What happens to that congressman's salary? Nothing. Now his evil twin comes. Inflation goes way up, unemployment goes way up, interest rates go way up, prosperity diminishes, disappears, foreigners are at our borders with weapons. Thereafter, the animals are starving to death out in the fields. They can't be done. The trees are barren, there's no fruit, and the little children are dying in the orphanages. What happens to that congressman's salary? Nothing. You know, they don't bear the consequences of their own actions. So if I had one policy I could do, and just one, is I would take all government officials and put them all on commission. I would take a shadow portfolio of $5 million. Every congressman, the day he or she takes office, you give him a shadow portfolio of $5 million. You let him keep all the capital gains tax-free, but hold him personally liable for all the capital losses. I guarantee you they would never, ever, ever vote the way they do now. They don't have skin in the game, and you've got the classic agency problem. I would spend other people's money a lot more than I'd spend my own money. And that's your household problem. And how do you get it so that these people behave like you would were it your money? And that's the whole thing. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been just lovely.
Dr. Laffer, thank you very much for your cogent, compelling, and indeed highly entertaining speech to us on the many issues and debates that you face on the other side of the Atlantic. Perhaps on this side, the divide isn't quite as clear-cut yet. But if the old adage is true that the United Kingdom's only ever 5 or 10 years behind the United States, then that difference and clear-cut division of different economic policies is sure as hell going to get clear-cut very, very soon in the UK. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you. Thank you very much for being our guest at the Institute of Economic Affairs over the last couple of days, and thanks very much for contributing to what is a vital debate on this side of the Atlantic as well as your own. Please join me in thanking Dr. Arthur Laffer.